Okay, one more time. We're back. Casey Green, we're here at the ASU GSV Innovation Summit. I'm pleased to welcome Sandy Speicher, who's the Managing Director of IDEO. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are on the Shindig platform. This is a collaborative initiative with Shindig and eCampus Media, publishes eSchool News and eCampus News. So we're at the last waning hours of the ASU GSV Innovation Summit. Have you been here all 3 days, Sandy?
I have.
Yeah. So let me begin with your moment for shameless self-promotion. Tell us about IDEO.
Well,
60 seconds.
Yeah, that's right. So IDEO is a design and innovation consultancy. We work globally. We have 10 offices around the world, and our job is to help organizations innovate. And I lead our work in education, which is about basically helping to design new schools and new tools, and also help the sector think about how they innovate.
A number of folks who have been in the chair that you're in and the black box that we're in here at the ASU GSV Innovation Summit have talked about design.
Yeah.
Michael Crow, president of ASU, mentioned it. A number of other folks have mentioned it. I started doing work in the tech industry going back just after the Mac launch. I'm dating myself a little bit, but your company designed the mouse. Your company designed the cube for Steve Jobs at Next, and known in many ways for product design, stunning, clever, innovative product design. How does that translate into organizational and process design?
Yeah. So IDEO has been around for about 30 years, which for a design firm is fairly has longevity. Yeah. And we did really start out in product design, and the Apple mouse, the first commercial mouse for Apple, is probably the most kind of classic known thing that we helped design. Right. But then over time, as we were creating all these things that people were responding to really well, people would say to us, "Hey, you just designed that mouse. Could you design this service, or could you design this space, or could you design this organization?" Because they kept seeing how compelling the things that we were creating were. And because we never saw ourselves only as product designers, but instead recognized that we had a process of designing, and that process being fundamentally human-centered, understanding what people really care about and need, and thinking about how we would design for them, it's allowed us to, a couple years ago when I got a phone call from a really wise person in Peru who said, "Hey, we're looking to actually disrupt education in our country. Can you design us a school system that would be affordable, scalable, and excellent?" I've never done that before, but my response was, of course I can, because I have a process.
Okay. The process is consistent whether it's product or service.
Correct.
Okay.
Or experience or organization.
Which is easiest to do, but which is the most challenging? Is it easier to do a product? Is it easier to do a service? Is it easier to do an experience? And answer that first, and then I've got a follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, easy isn't quite a fair word, because I think everything has its difficulty. Yeah. I think that what's happening in our world is we're taking this process and using it for more and more complex questions, like the design of a whole school system, or like the design of social movements, or these things that are not just for one organization alone, or not just for one type of person, but actually include multiple perspectives and multiple points of view and multiple organizations. That's when it really stretches our process of design to then think about, how do we do this differently? How do we engage more people in it?
Yeah, but I'm a civilian, so I know virtually nothing about the design principles and processes you talk about. But as I think about some of the things that I read in our conversations that unfolds today, if I think about a product, that to me looks like a fairly linear process. I know it's not in terms of the way you folks approach it, but at least there's an end point, and you don't have a lot of moving parts after the product is at least done in the first build, and it's delivered to my hand reaching out for the Macintosh mouse in 1984.
Yeah.
If you're designing a process or an experience or an organization, you're building a framework, and then you're still dependent upon a lot of moving human parts in the implementation and deployment that is organic in its own. It's very different.
Yeah, that's super insightful. Yeah. It is very different. I mean, in the spirit of it is approached similarly. And if I were to try to maybe synthesize the biggest difference, there's all the input and all the diverse opinions that you need to have when you're designing a complex system. But generally, a design process on a product looks like it has an end because you've gone through this whole process and you end up with the thing, and that thing goes into production, and that thing is on the shelves.
And I know you're going to do a 2.0, and there's continuous quality.
And exactly. But here's what I'm going to say is the difference is in a way that process ends with the thing. But when we're designing complex systems, essentially what happens is the process ends with the frameworks. There's kind of clarity about the kinds of things that we want to put in motion, and then it's a living system. So the kind of end point is less about the exactness of what gets built, but more about the frameworks that it's built from. And then you're essentially trying to create the kind of basic code for how a system will then behave.
Yeah, but again, and I may be parsing this a little too finely, the success of a physical product is a much easier thing to measure than the success of an organization or an experience in some ways. Because again, let's go back to the Macintosh mouse. It works. It doesn't. You're not dependent. You're less dependent upon human factors. Yeah, somebody's got to figure out, realize. And there were stories about this with the mouse.
Well, and how many people are using a mouse today?
But people putting them on the floor and think it's like a pedal.
I guess what I'm pushing on is that time.
They evolve.
Right.
They evolve.
But time is a big factor in this.
So let's take that process and put it in the context of education.
Yeah.
Which is, can we agree different? Can we stipulate that education is different?
I can definitely agree that education is different.
So in terms of the design process for education, compared to some of the design process for other contexts, services, experiences, how is education, from the design process perspective, how is it different?
I would say about 10 years ago when we would help groups actually understand what design process really was about, we had this sort of like these rules of thumb, like you begin by interviewing people, understand what they care about. You probably only need 8 to 10 people because you're going to start hearing the same thing again and again. This is a kind of rule of thumb that we would tell people. In our education work, that number is in the thousands, right? Like the scale of people that we need to include, because people feel an immense amount of ownership around where the design ends up going. The process is much more inclusive. It's less about designing for people and more about designing with people.
How much of that inclusion, though, is symbolic, and how much of it is substantive? The fact that people feel engaged in their organizations, many of them are educational entities, have a kind of internal governance that's not command and control, that differentiates them from other entities and other communities, if you will. And how much of it is also the some substantive part of, that last interview gives us that extra bit of insight that we didn't get from the 30 interviews earlier.
I guess, though, it is definitely substantive when we're engaging people in that process, but that is a very intentionally designed engagement. It's not just asking people, what do you think? What do you wish for? What do you want? But it's really at first about understanding people's lives, about their needs, their motivations, thinking about what might be resonant for that, then re-engaging people and getting feedback on the kinds of experiences that we're imagining, and then engaging them and making them better. We have this format we emerged through our education, this method that we use a lot. We call it Make It Awesome workshops. We actually get to a point in design where we have a set of ideas, and instead of saying to people, what do you think about this? We say, actually, help us make this awesome. What would make this idea awesome for you? And that's a really different way of getting feedback than just saying, do you like it or not?
What about the presentation and training? And again, I'm parsing product versus experience. You design a product, there's the presentation, and there's some level of training. Sometimes maybe a little, might be a lot, depending on it. You design a process, you design an experience, and there may be a huge level of training, because again, the implementation is the power resides with the people as opposed to the product in one sense.
Yeah, and this is, again, where people being involved plays a really huge role, because what we never want to do is create something that you have to then essentially onboard everybody else to without it feeling like a natural evolution. We actually worked with San Francisco School District to redesign their food system across their 130 or so schools. And we had over 1,300 people involved in that process through many different ways. And so a lot of what's happening as they're rolling this out has to do with how they're engaging people in creating where the directions are headed, rather than just expecting that we're going to train people to then roll it out. Of course, in many other instances, we do have to really think about training, and not just from a information transfer, but in more of a how are we engaging people in actually shaping that next stage of the future.
And I would suspect as well how this is different and making people comfortable with that change in innovation.
And I like to point out there's actually a really long process of that. So instead of thinking that, as soon as you have this grand idea of, for instance, how blended learning might work, you actually have to meet people where they are and sort of bring them toward where you see them heading.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen overnight. There's actually a multi-year process. And you have to think not just about what are you telling them, how are you training them, but what are the systems that you're putting in place? How are you mentoring them? How are you guiding them? What resources are you giving them to help them in their moments of need?
So actually, let me pick up on the blended learning model. A lot of folks think they know a lot about blended learning. And yet my guess is that the IDEO process would reveal a lot that we don't know, and lots of ways about how we can do better. Some of that you could say applies to all contexts. Some of that may apply to highly unique contexts. Without giving away too much of the secret sauce or being a free consultant, what would that process look like? Here, sign the contract, walk me through the process of what I can expect with you guys to essentially fix my blended learning initiative or help me launch one.
Well, the way that we start any collaboration is really with a question that's framed around design. So how might I implement blended learning? Not a great design question. But I think there is, the question of how might we most effectively engage students given the conditions?
Well, so you're helping me frame the question in one sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's rare that someone says, we need to make a blended learning environment. It's often that they have deep questions about how they're achieving their mission.
Okay.
And then blended learning is actually a solution in a way toward that.
Okay.
When we helped create Innova schools in Peru, we did end with a blended learning approach was the core of our recommendations for them. And that had a lot to do with the state of readiness that teachers were in their country to actually help deliver an international quality education. We had to look a lot around what tools were available to help support them not having had that international quality education. And I'll say one of the biggest barriers of that was actually the available technology, in particular connecting with Spanish speakers. Because a lot of that is actually being developed out of the US right now. And so what Innova had to look at was until those tools were really there, because they couldn't be creating all of the tools and all of the content, what were they going to do in the short term, and then what did they end up having to do in the long term? So that's, again, a process that gets designed.
So if I'm listening to this conversation, and it sounds really interesting, and I hear a lot of other stuff going on in education and elsewhere, people are saying design thinking. Design process, as something decidedly different with great outcomes, and because they're saying that, aren't they?
I mean,
and you want them to say that.
I'm a believer.
Yeah. Okay. What are the three most important? If I'm going to sort of begin that walk down that path, what are the three most important things I need to understand about what that journey is going to look like?
Yeah. The first is really about being grounded in empathy. A lot of times we have ideas and answers in our minds already based on our own life experience, but what's really important is to actually connect with people, the people that you're actually designing for and people that you're serving. So I'd say that's something to keep in mind.
So in other words, and I'm going to be very blunt about it, your experts aren't going to come in with the arrogance that are sometimes associated with consultants. In fact, you use the term empathy.
Yeah, yes. And I mean, I would also say as designers, our job is to be in as much humility as possible, because we have to be asking great questions in order to find new answers. Another thing I would say compared to the kind of mental model perhaps of consulting is a lot of times the approach is to start with the answer and then fill in the blanks. What are the ways we're going to execute on that answer? An innovation process, the outcome of that process is the answer. You actually don't know what you're going to get to because your job is to innovate, right?
Okay.
So that's actually very hard for a lot of people because we take longer to get to the answer, but that answer has been tried and iterated upon through very tangible interactions with people, through a lot of sketching and a lot of imagination and a lot of feedback. And so we end with the answer rather than sort of start with the answer.
Okay. And number three?
Woo! Wasn't there like a third somewhere in there? Did I go somewhere
Maybe
in the middle?
2.5.
It was 2.5.
We'll let it go with that. All right, Sandy, thanks
Well,
for
I can give you a third.
No.
I love it.
You have a third? All right, I'll give you the third.
I have a third.
Yeah.
Prototyping. Making stuff in order to learn about it. The kind of connection between the mind and the hands, right? A lot of times we think, and we feel like we've got it resolved perfectly. And then you go to make it, and it's nothing like you thought about, or the experience people actually don't like. So a lot of our process includes trying out the ideas that we're imagining. If that's curriculum, with a mouse, it's pretty easy to think you build that experience. But with education, you can
I know. I saw some of the early
curriculum.
designs of the mouse and how that changed over time. So,
Yes. Yeah.
So it is an iterative process.
It's an iterative
even
process.
to getting to 1.0.
Yeah. Well said.
Great.
Yeah.
All right, Sandy Speicher, thanks very much for joining us. You're the Managing Director of IDEO. We've got one last conversation today, folks. Thanks for staying with us. Wendy LeDuc from eSchool Media will be with us for a closing conversation about what we've learned these last couple of days here at the ASU GSV Innovation Conference. We'll be right back.